The November wind cut through Evangeline's threadbare shawl like a blade. Her fingers trembled as she clutched the eviction notice, the sheriff's words still echoing in her mind. 3 days. She had 3 days before they threw her belongings into the street. The general store's wooden steps creaked under her worn boots as she approached the towering figure loading supplies on his wagon. Everyone knew Matthias Blackwood, the quiet rancher who kept to himself, whose shoulders were broad enough to carry the world's troubles. "Please help me. I'll do anything," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the howling wind. The desperation in her tone made him turn, his dark eyes taking in her gaunt face and the paper shaking in her hands. Before we continue with this incredible story of survival and unexpected love, hit that subscribe button because what happens next will change everything you thought you knew about marriage proposals. Matthias studied her for a long moment, snow beginning to fall around them like a benediction. The woman before him was clearly starving, her dress hanging loose on her small frame, her eyes holding the kind of fear that came from having nowhere left to run. His response came quietly, cutting through the storm like a prayer. "Will you marry me?" Evangeline's breath caught in her throat, forming small clouds in the frigid air. "Marry you?" The words tumbled from her lips like broken glass. She searched his weathered face for some sign of jest, but Matthias Blackwood's expression remained steady as stone. "I need a wife," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of mountain winds. "You need a home. Seems we might help each other." The eviction notice crumpled in her fist as she stared at this stranger who offered salvation wrapped in the most impossible terms. She knew nothing of him beyond his reputation for fairness and the way other men stepped aside when he walked through town. "I have nothing to offer you," she whispered, shame coloring her pale cheeks. "No dowry, no family name worth claiming. I'm ruined goods in this town's eyes." Matthias stepped closer, his massive frame blocking the wind that had been cutting through her thin clothing. "That's where you're wrong, Evangeline. You're standing here asking for help instead of stealing what you need. That tells me everything about your character." The way he spoke her name, gentle as a prayer, made something long frozen inside her chest begin to thaw. But marriage to a virtual stranger? The very idea should have terrified her, yet standing in his shadow felt safer than anywhere she'd been in months. The wind carried the scent of coming snow as Evangeline found herself speaking truths she'd never voiced aloud. "My husband died of fever 6 months ago," she began, her words barely audible above the storm. "Left me with nothing but debts I cannot pay." Matthias listened without judgment as she continued, her voice growing stronger with each admission. "The bank foreclosed on our homestead. The townspeople whisper that I brought bad luck to my husband, that I'm cursed. No one will hire me, and winter is coming." She lifted her chin despite the shame burning in her chest. "I've been living in the church cellar, eating scraps from the pastor's table. In 3 days, even that refuge will be gone." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the whistling wind through the bare cottonwood branches. Matthias studied her face, seeing past the hollow cheeks and desperate eyes to something that stirred his long-dormant protective instincts. "I have a ranch 20 miles north," he said finally. "Good land, sturdy cabin, but it's lonely as a grave. Lost my first wife in childbirth 5 years back. Haven't had the heart to court anyone since." His honesty hung in the air like an offering. "I'm not looking for love, Evangeline. Just partnership. Someone to share the burden of surviving out here." The ceremony lasted barely 5 minutes in the preacher's cramped parlor, witnessed only by his wife and the falling snow outside frost-covered windows. Evangeline's hand trembled as she signed her new name, the ink still wet when Matthias helped her into his wagon. The ride to his ranch passed in silence, broken only by creaking wheels and the steady rhythm of his horse's hooves. Evangeline pulled his heavy coat tighter around her shoulders, breathing in the scent of leather and wood smoke that seemed to cling to everything he owned. When the cabin came into view through the swirling snow, she felt her breath catch. It was larger than she'd expected, built from solid pine logs with smoke curling invitingly from the stone chimney. A barn stood nearby, and she could hear cattle lowing softly in the distance. "This is home now," Matthias said simply, helping her down from the wagon. His hands were gentle despite their size, and he waited until she found her footing before releasing her. Inside, the cabin was sparse but clean, with handmade furniture that spoke of careful craftsmanship. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across walls lined with books she hadn't expected to find. "Your room is through there," he said, nodding toward a door near the back. I sleep in a loft. You'll have privacy. 3 weeks into their arrangement, Evangeline discovered Matthias carved wooden animals by firelight. She found him one evening whittling a tiny deer, his massive hands moving with surprising delicacy as wood shavings curled onto the hearthstones. My daughter would have been 4 this winter, he said without looking up, his voice barely above a whisper. Used to carve her toys before she was born. Never seemed right to stop. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. Evangeline set down her mending and moved closer, drawn by the vulnerability in his tone. She was beautiful, wasn't she? Evangeline asked softly, understanding flowing between them like water, finding its course. Matthias nodded, his callous thumb smoothing the deer's carved flank. Rebecca said she had my stubborn chin and her mother's gentle eyes. Lost them both the same night. Snow pelted the windows as Evangeline reached out, her fingers barely grazing his wrist. The simple touch made him look up, and she saw past his careful walls to the grief he carried like stones in his chest. I lost 2 babies, she whispered, her own long-buried pain surfacing. Both too early to hold. My first husband said it proved I was barren, worthless as a wife. Matthias set down his knife, turning to face her fully. You're not worthless, Evangeline. You're the strongest person I know. The morning brought news that chilled Evangeline more than the January wind. Matthias returned from town with supplies and a grim expression that made her stomach clench with familiar dread. Harold Brennan's been asking questions about you, he said, setting flour sacks on the kitchen table. Claims you still owe him money from your husband's debts. Evangeline's hands stilled over the bread dough she'd been kneading. Brennan owned half the businesses in town and had a reputation for collecting what he was owed, regardless of a person's circumstances. How much? She whispered, though she already knew the answer would be more than they could manage. Doesn't matter, Matthias said firmly, moving to stand beside her at the wooden counter. You're my wife now. Your debts became mine the day we married. The simple declaration made her throat tighten. No one had ever stood between her and the wolves circling her door. But I brought this trouble to your home, she protested. Matthias covered her flour-dusted hands with his own, stilling her anxious movements. This is our home, Evangeline. Our troubles, our solutions. Brennan wants to intimidate you, but he'll find I'm not so easily moved. The warmth of his touch spread up her arms like sunrise breaking over frozen ground, thawing places in her heart she'd thought permanently winterlocked. The realization struck Evangeline like lightning on a clear day. She was falling in love with her husband. It happened while watching him tend a sick calf in the barn, his gentle hands coaxing medicine between the animal's lips while murmuring soft reassurances. The same hands that could fell trees and break horses moved with infinite tenderness when something needed healing. The thought terrified her more than Brennan's threats ever could. Love meant vulnerability, and vulnerability had brought her nothing but pain. Matthias sensed the change in her immediately. She began retreating into polite distance, her smiles becoming careful and measured. The easy companionship they'd built over winter months suddenly felt fragile as spring ice. Did I do something wrong? He asked one evening, finding her staring into the fire instead of reading beside him as had become their custom. Evangeline shook her head, unable to voice the truth lodged in her throat like a stone. How could she explain that his kindness was unraveling every wall she'd built around her heart? You've been nothing but good to me, she whispered, the admission carrying weight neither of them expected. Then why won't you look at me anymore? The quiet hurt in his voice made her chest ache. Because when I do, I forget this was supposed to be just an arrangement, she thought but couldn't say. Harold Brennan arrived on a Tuesday morning with 3 men and a sheriff's badge that gleamed like a threat in the spring sunlight. Evangeline watched from the kitchen window as they rode up the path, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. Blackwood, Brennan called from his saddle, his voice carrying the authority of money and political connections. We need to discuss your wife's outstanding obligations. Matthias emerged from a barn, his movements deliberate and unhurried despite the tension crackling in the air. Those debts were settled when she became my wife, he said evenly. Not according to territorial law, the sheriff interjected, unfolding an official-looking document. A woman's premarital debts remain her responsibility regardless of marriage status. Evangeline's legs nearly buckled. She believed their marriage would protect her, but Brennan had found a way around even that sanctuary. The amount has grown considerably with interest, Brennan continued, his smile cold as winter wind. $500, or we'll be forced to seize assets equivalent to the debt. Matthias's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. And if we refuse? Then your wife comes with us to work off what she owes, Brennan replied, his meaning clear as mountain water. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire, ready to consume everything they'd built together. I'll go with them. Evangeline's words cut through the tension like a blade, making Matthias turn toward her with something close to fury blazing in his dark eyes. Like hell you will, he said, his voice carrying a finality that made Brennan's men shift uncomfortably in their saddles. But Evangeline stepped forward, her chin raised despite the terror coursing through her veins. I won't let you lose everything because of my mistakes, Matthias. This ranch, your home, it's all you have left of Rebecca and your daughter. The pain that flashed across his face nearly broke her resolve, but she pressed on. $500 would ruin you. At least this way, you keep what matters. What matters? Matthias closed the distance between them in 3 strides, his hands gripping her shoulders with desperate intensity. You think this land matters more than you do? The raw emotion in his voice made her breath catch. She searched his face, seeing past his careful control to something that made her heart stutter against her ribs. Evangeline, he said, her name falling from his lips like a prayer. Don't you understand? You are what matters. Everything else is just wood and stone. Brennan cleared his throat impatiently. Touching as this is, we have business to conclude. The woman comes with us, or you pay what she owes. Matthias reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a leather pouch that clinked with the weight of gold coins. The sound made Brennan's eyes widen with surprise and something that might have been disappointment. $500, Matthias said, counting out the money with steady hands. The debt is paid in full. Evangeline stared at him in shock. Where did you get that kind of money? She whispered. Been saving for years, he replied, never taking his eyes off Brennan. Plan to buy more cattle, expand the herd. But some things matter more than cattle. Brennan accepted the payment with obvious reluctance, his schemes crumbling like sand. The sheriff folded his documents, and within minutes, the 3 men were riding away, leaving only dust and the echo of hoofbeats. When they were alone, Evangeline turned to face her husband, tears streaming down her cheeks. You gave up your dreams for me, she said, her voice breaking. Matthias cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. My dreams changed the day you walked into my life, Evangeline. I thought I wanted land and cattle, but what I really wanted was someone to share it all with. The truth hung between them like sunrise breaking over the mountains, illuminating everything that had been hidden in shadow. I love you too, Evangeline whispered, the words she'd been afraid to speak finally finding their voice. I've loved you since the night you shared your grief with me, but I was too frightened to believe it could be real. Matthias pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in creation. The scent of leather and wood smoke that had become home enveloped her as she pressed her face against his chest. When they returned to town the following week, walking hand in hand down the main street, the whispers followed them like shadows. But something had changed in how they carried themselves. Where once Evangeline had hunched her shoulders against judgment, now she stood tall beside her husband. At the general store, Mrs. Henley made a pointed comment about sudden wealth paying for respectability. Matthias stepped forward, his presence filling the small space like gathering thunder. My wife's debts were honorably paid, he said quietly, his voice carrying enough steel to cut glass. Any man who questions her character answers to me. The store fell silent except for the tick of the wall clock. Mrs. Henley's face flushed red, but she said nothing more. Outside, Evangeline squeezed his hand. You didn't have to defend me like that, she said softly. Matthias stopped walking and turned to face her. Yes, I did. You're mine to protect now, just as I'm yours. 6 months later, Evangeline stood in their garden, watching Matthias repair the fence that would soon contain the cattle they'd bought with money earned from her preserves and his crafted furniture. Their partnership had grown beyond survival into prosperity built on mutual respect and unwavering love. The townspeople had gradually warmed to them, seeing the genuine affection that radiated from their every interaction. Even Mrs. Henley now purchased Evangeline's strawberry jam without comment. That evening, as spring rain drummed against their roof, Matthias presented her with a carved wooden box. Inside, nestled in soft cloth, lay 2 small figures, a man and woman standing hand in hand. For our story, he said simply, his eyes reflecting the firelight. So we never forget how we found each other. Evangeline traced the delicate features with her fingertip, marveling at the love expressed through such careful craftsmanship. What started as desperation had blossomed into something neither had dared hope for. As she settled into his arms before the fire, watching flames dance in the hearth they'd built together, Evangeline thought about the journey that brought them here. Two broken people who'd found healing in each other's kindness. Have you ever found love in the most unexpected places? Tell us about your moment when everything changed in the comments below.